Friends, colleagues, and first time listeners, welcome to another episode of Brain Buzz. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle,
And I'm Drake.
and today we are delighted to be joined by founder and owner of Sexual Exploitation Education, a Vancouver based organization focusing on awareness and education about sexual exploitation, and consultant specializing in helping organizations develop sexual exploitation policies, Tiana Sharifi. Tiana, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Tiana. We're really excited to have this episode out because we actually got you on in a non-conventional way for us. Your sister actually reached out to us. She's a listener, so it's confirmed. You guys, if you're listening right now, you're not the only listener out there. This is exciting. But you reached out through your sister, and your sister connected with me, and then we got you on because your work is amazing and it's really cool and really impactful and something we haven't talked about or even remotely breached in our episodes up until now. So, Tiana, you do work in sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Do you want to just give us an idea of what the scope of this is, or even maybe just defining what sexual exploitation is?
Yeah, and I think to do that, I have to take a step back and define human trafficking because I think a lot of us misunderstand what that term is. So, human trafficking is essentially modern day slavery. And a lot of times when we think about modern day slavery, we think about labor trafficking. But in fact, about 75% of the world's human trafficking is sexual exploitation. So when it comes to human trafficking, you're actually looking at somebody being controlled by another person for the purpose of exploiting them. And so it actually does not involve crossing borders like we think human smuggling, or when you watch the movie Taken with Liam Neeson. And it's more about being controlled. So you can be human trafficked in your own backyard, in your own home, as long as somebody is influencing or controlling your movements and actions for the purpose of exploitation. And so then sexual exploitation is anybody under the age of 18 who's exchanging a sexual act for anything in return. And the reason this falls under human trafficking is because there's a coercion aspect to it. So what we see is that a child or youth has a particular need, whether it's love, acceptance, safety, or drugs, money, shelter, and they feel coerced to exchange a sexual act of theirs in order to get that need met. And the person who is sexually exploiting them is called an exploiter, or essentially a predator.
Right. And so that's actually a really good point because honestly, my head, whenever I was thinking about our episode today, kind of did go to, sadly, to the movie Taken, right? And the idea is like, I think it's kind of in our heads, and this happens, I'm sure, with a lot of topics, is that it's something that happens overseas or, in different countries more, and it's not necessarily something that's going on within our country. But like you said, the case is actually that this happens a lot, and it's more likely to happen within your own country, in your own backyard.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. You go ahead.
I think that there are these natural misconceptions even about victims, like what victims look like, that they're immigrants or they're in poverty. But yeah, the reality is that it's the average looking person who's victimized and the average looking person who's the offender. So
absolutely. And so, Tiana, what kind of exploitation, like what is going on with exploitation, with sexual exploitation? What are the most frequently what are the things that happen most often whenever it comes to sexual exploitation? Like, what are they doing? What are people doing specifically to the ones that are being exploited?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we look at the term sexual exploitation, there's a range, right? Because if you're exchanging a sexual act for anything, sexual exploitation can look like youth issues where, there's teen relationships and one party feels the pressure to do a sexual act that they're not comfortable with in order to get love, or you go to a party and you feel like you have to hook up with the person who's hosting the party because you want to be popular. And then it can range to the extreme where it's human traffickers and pimps who are grooming children and youth into prostitution, which we call human trafficking because children can't prostitute themselves. So when it comes to grooming with these human traffickers, essentially what they're doing is they're posing as a boyfriend or a friend. And they're targeting these kids. Mostly it's now online, as that first form of contact is online. And they start to form a relationship with that kid. So if they're pretending to be a boyfriend, which is about, more than 50% of the time, that's what's happening. They form a relationship with that youth. They gift that youth a lot of things. They provide them this idea of a lifestyle that they can have together. And they isolate them from their friends and their family. And they start to introduce them more to a party lifestyle and living in downtown, and just like a glamorous image of what any teen would really want. And then down the road, they use any kind of debt that was used against them, and love and everything really to isolate, and then coerce that youth into exchanging a sexual act for money. And it can be something as, as discreet as saying, babe, like I've spent all this money, like I'm having a little bit of a hard time right now. I have a friend here, and he's willing to pay for a date with you. And that's kind of how it starts off there. Or you have pimps who are using females to recruit other females. And so these females, they show these other girls like, hey, this is a lifestyle that I have, and you can have this exact same lifestyle. Let me show you to a friend of mine who can hook you up.
Yeah, it's scary. The scope of it is just it's a lot. It's scary to think about. I think is like, the ways that people can kind of be persuaded and convinced to do things because they owe someone,
Yeah.
and especially coming from, I think a really interesting point that you're talking about is boyfriends or significant others as the gateway into that. And like, they are coming from a position where they're trying to get your trust, and trying to be like, a significant other that you can rely on, and then using that trust against them. It's quite scary. Is this often something that happens before the age of 18, that this is like the most of the work, like what you're seeing in the sexual exploitation work?
Yeah, definitely. It is. A lot of victims are under the age of 18. Most of them are under the age of 25. But a lot of them are under the age of 18. And the reason for that, really, at the end of the day, is that unfortunately, teens and kids, they don't have the resources that a lot of adults have, right? So one of the warning signs, actually, of an exploiter is someone who's only a few years older. Because if you think about it, so if I'm starting to date somebody, and they start to buy me things, and they have access to a car and ID for alcohol, well, it doesn't make a difference because I can also have access to those same things.
Mhm.
So it doesn't create a power imbalance. But with kids and teens, it's very easy to create a power imbalance, with someone who's under 18, because they don't have education, they don't have the work experience, they don't have access to money to afford certain things that they might want, like getting their hair done and their nails done, and like the Instagram model image and whatnot. So it's very easy to prey on them. Yeah, definitely.
One thing you mentioned earlier is that sometimes these can occur within age groups. So you said, a teen going to a party and maybe feeling obligated to hook up with the host of that party. How does that power imbalance play out in relationships where they're peers in terms of age, at least?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, there is, so peer exploitation is a thing, and that's something that we're seeing a lot right now. I mean, 1/3 of sexual offenses against youth are committed by another youth. So that's actually what we do see. And the power imbalances, again, it just comes down to, we all have needs, and especially when you're a teen, think about self-esteem and just the bubble that you live in. And I think that really gets exploited, that the sense of wanting to be accepted, especially with social media now, and pressures, to sext and all those things. So we definitely see even a power imbalance just within age groups, right? You have the grade 12s host a party, and they invite the grade 8s or grade 9s. And obviously, when you're a grade 8 or grade 9, you're going to want to fit in, and you don't know what's acceptable and what's not. And so it's very easy to misuse that naivety. So
Yeah,
Yeah, certainly.
absolutely. I think that's a really good, like, kind of segue into the way I've been thinking about it, at least. And that's something that I thought as well, is high school and that age group specifically is a very unique age group where there's a lot of transitions.
yeah.
And like you said, you want to fit in. There's self-esteem is a big part of that, finding yourself, knowing where you're going, and you're really susceptible to influence. and people that might be, you know, a little bit more experienced in whatever avenue you're in. And so I'm thinking, like, with that, I think of that age gap that we've set up in our laws, where, you know, there's a certain at a certain age you're now an adult, and then you're a child after that. So there's a lot of that, you know. First off, could you explain those rules? Because I feel like we've had this conversation before. You know, what's legal, what's not legal, because you can have, you know, a graduate hanging out with the grade 11 or 12, but now if they were dating before, there's, you know, there's a lot of ambiguity with that. Could you explain that so we can kind of figure out what's actually, you know, child predator versus just pure predator interactions?
Such a good question, and yeah, it's really funny. So the law used to be that it's called the age of protection or age of consent, and it used to be 14. Now they recently changed it to 16, but essentially what that means is that at the age of 16 or older, you can consent to having sexual activity with anybody of any age. So 16-year-old technically could sleep with a 7-year-old. It's gross, but legally it can happen. Don't know why that is. I personally don't agree with that. But that being said, there are close in age exceptions. So the law recognized, okay, we want to keep kids safe, but we also want to make sure that we're not criminalizing teen relationships. So there are close in age exceptions. So 12 to 13-year-olds can consent to somebody who's up to 2 years of age older than them with sexual activity. And then if you're 14 and 15, you can consent to someone who's up to 5 years of age older than you. And so it kind of works vice versa. So if you're 17, legally you cannot have sexual relations with someone who's 13 or 12 years old.
Right.
So that's kind of how you think about it. Now, that being said, so the age of consent is 16, but if you're under the age of 18, it counts as sexual exploitation is if there is the exchange of a sexual act for something in return, or somebody is in a position of trust or authority. So I don't know if that
Absolutely.
makes sense, but
Yeah, no, that,
Yeah.
that makes sense for sure. Like, I think, you know, and that's the authority is the unique thing too, where you're talking about, you know, these authority figures and where they're using that against these people to exploit them, right? So it's, you know, you could have maybe a tutor, or like, you know, a substitute teacher, because substitute teachers are quite young. Like, you can be a young teacher in a high school now, and so that's also a really unique area that has been got a lot of publicity, especially in America, about, you know, young teachers and how they're interacting with their grade 12s or grade 11s, right? And so it's really interesting to hear from you. That's the Canadian laws, right? So we're not stretching to America or other states and things like that, right?
I'm not sure about their age of consent laws. But
Mm-hmm.
with ours, it also adheres to online as well. So I think that a lot of people don't even think about that. You have the 14-year-olds who are talking with the 20-year-olds and being flirtatious, and they don't realize, like, nope, by law that's actually a predator, because that law abides to or makes sense with that with the online platform as well.
I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about that because we've been speaking recently with several of our guests to talk about social media use and just the way it's being used and the impacts on relationships and all sorts of stuff. And they've been some really interesting conversations. But do you see a correlation or a relationship there between online use or online social media use and exploitation? Is that something that's kind of on the radar for people like yourself?
It is huge. So over 90% of sexual exploitation is now first facilitated online. And honestly, I think the biggest thing for me with the online platform is we used to say kids who are vulnerable to being sexually exploited worked kind of like the way that Maslow's hierarchy of needs works. So, the concept of any kids or teens who lacked basic necessities like, shelter, and then moving upwards, so that the less you have in life, the more vulnerable you are to being exploited. Now, because of online, Maslow's hierarchy of needs has kind of flipped backwards because people use the internet for those higher needs, right? They use the internet for things like relationships and self-esteem and love. And so if kids are all online and they have those needs and that's what they're seeking online, you have pretty much any kid is vulnerable to being exploited. And that's literally what we're seeing. I mean, we had Michael Bannon. He's a popular human trafficking case in Vancouver. And this is in 2018. And he groomed kids who were about, 14, 15, 16 years old across Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, who were just average teens, and they got groomed online. So
Tiana, can I ask a question? Where are the predators most likely to be finding and and interacting with kids in a predatory nature? Like where is the most likely spots that kids will be exploited or taken advantage of online?
Yeah, it's pretty much anywhere that kids are at. And then the more popular an app, the more population of teens on a certain platform, that's where you're going to see exploiters. So even though there's a lot of apps out there right now that are popular, Facebook, Instagram, those seem to still be, Snapchat, those are still like the top platforms we're seeing recruitment. And then, of course, you have certain apps that are promoting exploitative behaviors. But I think most of the grooming is still happening on Facebook Messenger and Instagram is what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this might be me misunderstanding or not knowing enough, but like, is catfishing a big part of this process and lying about your identity to get someone comfortable with you and then proceeding? Like, what are the red flags, I guess, for your people's children or just you as a regular person that you might be getting sexually exploited or there might be a chance of getting sexually exploited?
Yeah, the catfishing thing. So what we found is that it's not actually lying about age. I think we all have kind of an image of the predator online is that really old creepy guy with like Cheeto stains on his shirt, and he's in his basement, and like he drives a white van and he hands out candy to the kids. But they don't typically lie about age, but they do lie about identity with regards to how they have a connection with that kid. So what we see is, it's not the predator who is saying he's actually a 15-year-old girl. It's the predator who's saying, oh, I see that you like soccer. Well, I play soccer as well. And then trying to connect with the kid in that way.
Right.
And so these kids, I mean, they're not like, that's where like when the meetup happens, they're not surprised as to who they're seeing or meeting up with. It's just that person's identity is being misconstrued. So again, with Michael Bannon, for example, this trafficker was on Facebook, and that's how he groomed his victims. He just sent out a mass message to all these teens, and he essentially told them, I have do you want to make quick, easy cash? Or he'd say, I have a model agency and you'd be an amazing model. We can take photographs of you. And so the teens that when they were communicating with him, they didn't think that he was, a teen, but they just thought that he was maybe like a different type of person.
Different goals and different reasons to be interacting with them. Yeah, that's a really interesting thought because as a millennial, I'm thinking of like just literally Catfish on MTV being like, oh yeah, you're actually just like a 70-year-old man when you're saying you're a 14-year-old girl. That's not going to gain the trust, like you said, and like that relationship is not going to be something that they can exploit if they've completely lied off the bat. They have to gain that trust from them. So that's scary and telling that that's what's going on.
100%. And I mean, that's not to say there is catfishing that happens. I mean, but it's not so much of like the grooming. So like the catfishing that happens tends to be more with sextortion, where you have the predators who just want to get a naked photo or a video. And that's like a much quicker process, unfortunately, with certain online platforms. So not to say that it doesn't happen, but with traffickers, what we see is more of that relationship building and trust, like you're pointing to.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about the relationship now then? Because I'm really curious as to what these relationships, how they grow, and like what the connection is with the victim and the predator, and how long they might last. Because this to me is scary, thinking of a boyfriend girlfriend where someone might from the offset just be like, oh, it's just a toxic relationship, you're bad for each other, not really seeing that someone's actually exploiting the other person and using them to their advantage and keeping them in that relationship. So what do these relationships tend to look like in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I mean, it can range. And it honestly, it just depends on the youth. So if there's a youth who's harder to groom, it's going to take longer. It can take a few days all the way up to, you know, a year or even more than that. So what we see is that that relationship starts, that person tends to be a few years older than the teen. So they're typically in their 20s. And they form that relationship and they start to buy things for that person. Again, a lot of times it is girls that are in these relationships and being groomed. And so, you know, they start to pay for the nails and the hair and get them designer purses and shoes, and then slowly start to encourage them to come to parties where drugs are provided. And sometimes those drugs are laced with other drugs. Sometimes they're just introduced to those drugs, but it's being provided. And this whole time that youth has no idea that there is a debt that's being, you know, there's a tab on them and they're not aware.
Yeah.
And so at some point when that trafficker feels comfortable enough that they have enough manipulation against that youth, that's when they introduce the actual exploitation piece. And that can look different. It can look like harsh violence, you know, just confining someone into a room and drugging them out, and you have customers who are there ready to purchase children. Or it can look more like, you know, let's just put some naked pictures of you online and we can get a few $100s, you know, like OnlyFans, and we can just get like some money off of you that way, and then slowly getting them into that situation. There's also been cases where, you know, a boyfriend, quote unquote, will trick a female into sleeping with his friend for money, but then down the road you realize that that was a purchaser, that was a John, and that whole session was taped. And if she says anything or doesn't go along with it, then that tape is going to be sent to her family and her friends. So that's kind of how that whole thing works. And there's just so many barriers, you know, that come into place, like in terms of blackmail, and you've been isolated, and then it's kind of put on you, like you're making the choice to sell yourself. So it's a whole thing.
Yeah, it really is.
Yikes.
One thing I'm curious about is, like, and I know your answer is not going to be, you're going to be annoyed by the answer, by the question, but how bad is it?
Oh, good.
How bad is it? Right? Like, what is the scope of this? And I know you're going to say like what you're going to say, so I'm going to let you say it and go ahead.
You know, it sucks because we can't measure it. Is honestly what I'm going to say. It's bad. And I think what makes it bad, honestly, is the fact that it's such a hidden crime. And that's why I picked the acronym C for my agency, because it's such a hidden crime. And I think what makes it so bad is that it's hidden. So like you have no idea about the stuff that's going on in literally every community in the Lower Mainland, and in neighborhoods that you just would not think about. And then now you have the online platform. So it is increasing as well. I think we're seeing a lot of human trafficking cases and sexual exploitation cases rise. I mean, CyberTip, which is Canada's national tip line just on online exploitation, they've just had crazy increase of reports coming in over the past 10 years, and then especially over the past year because of the pandemic. So we're not seeing this crime go down. I think a lot of what we do see is there's a pattern or a trend with every other crime out there where it's decreasing over time, and with exploitation, unfortunately, it's not. It's hard to give numbers, and I was kind of saying this before we got started. It's impossible to track numbers with this issue. One, because how do you track what's happening online? And two, because of the coercion that takes place, you're going to have victims come forward and state that they're being exploited or human trafficked. And unfortunately, a lot of victims, given the nature of exploitation, don't even understand that that's what's being done to them. So, you know, I can tell you, okay, we had 500 cases of human trafficking charges, but that's not even close to the reality, because those are just charges of human trafficking, and majority of human trafficking cases actually get charged with different charges, because human trafficking is so difficult to get approved in court. So a lot of human traffickers get charged with drug crimes, for example, or assaults. So it's impossible to track, but I can tell you that it happens much more often than we think.
I think the reality of that too is, if there's one case, it's one too many, right? Like, so you know, we're talking about you're saying that we don't really know, and that the prevalence rates are probably a lot higher than they ought to be, we'd ever hope they would be. But the reality of the matter too is that if there's one case, then there's one case too many here.
Definitely.
So switching tacks a little bit, Tiana, because I know we talked about prevention and that's kind of the area we were focusing on. Maybe now would be a good time to talk about what we can do and the steps that we can take to help prevent individuals from, becoming trafficked.
Yeah, I mean, it's a loaded question because I think there's different avenues to prevention. I mean, one avenue of prevention is it's more impossible to target, but it's to look at societally, what are we normalizing? And I think that as a society, we do normalize a lot of exploitative behaviors, and we do, kind of promote it, especially with social media apps. Some apps promote, the kind of exploitation type route without being too specific. Things like OnlyFans, for example, or like Snapchat. There's just an encouragement out there for Instagram models, even, right? There's, I think, a certain type of encouragement to sexualize and objectify women and youth. So that's, one way of prevention is for us to be aware of that. And then the other form of prevention is to educate teens and adults on what to look out for, specifically when it comes to someone who's grooming. So again, you have, if you're a teen, things to look out for would be any kind of age difference with someone that you're talking with, whether it's online or in person, a guy or a girl, a boyfriend or a friend. If someone's a few years older than you, just looking out for that power imbalance, where is that age allowing them to have access to things that you don't have yourself. And then that leads to the gifting process. So this is a huge one. So being in some kind of relationship, whether it's friendship or not, with someone who's providing you gifts and especially drugs. So introducing you to a party lifestyle and they just happen to be providing you with unlimited alcohol and drugs, that's definitely a form of gifting. Even with regards to online, if you meet someone online and they want to pay for your plane ticket to come and visit them, and they'll host you in their home and they'll show you around, that's another type of gifting that we see. So any kind of gifting, any kind of age difference, and then last but not least would be just that isolation piece. So if someone is wanting to physically take you away from your community, to come visit them, or from your family and friends, so saying, oh, come move in with me if you want your freedom, for example, that's one form. And then emotional isolation as well. So you got someone who's telling you, like your friends are really immature, but you're mature for your age, so let's just hang out with my friends. Or, your parents are just so strict and they don't trust you. Like, why don't you just, if you want your freedom, come live with me. So those are kind of the three warning signs, I would say: the age difference, gifting, and isolation to look out for, and teaching teens that if they do see even one red flag, just to speak to an adult about it. Because we call it grooming for a reason. That person's not going to be a predator right off the bat. They're going to, manipulate you and create this kind of a story before they get to that point. So making sure that they speak up before it gets too late.
Yeah, almost like they're trying to drive a wedge between you and the people that you'd otherwise trust and trust their judgment and instinct on these things.
Yeah. And actually, I have a personal story to share if we have time for that.
Please,
absolutely,
of course,
yeah. So these warning signs, I just shoved it down my sister's throat. I have a little sister, and I just shoved it down her throat growing up. And she was, I'm sure she was fed up with me. And my parents, they were like, "Oh, you're in this field, so it feels like this is more prevalent than you think that it is. It doesn't happen that often." And so I had. I had a moment where I felt finally satisfied, where they understood that it is a prevalent issue. So my dad was opening up a coffee shop in Vancouver in the main area. And while he was opening it up, he was with my mom and my sister, and the store was closed, but they heard a knock on the door. So they open the door, and there's this young girl there around 16, and she has a suitcase with her, and she just looks disheveled, and she's crying, and she's on the phone. And she says, "Oh, can I come inside?" And so my dad said, "Yeah, of course you can come inside." And my sister's overhearing this girl's conversation on the phone. And again, because she knew the warning signs, she's listening to this girl, and the girl is telling her mom, like, I want to come back home, but he has my passport and my ID. And I don't know what to do because he has my dog and I love my dog. I can't just leave the dog back there. And he's being like really abusive right now. And so she's just going on and on and on. My sister, just knowing these warning signs, texts me. And so essentially what ended up happening is that she was being human trafficked at the house right behind the coffee shop. And
Wow.
we were able to catch on to these subtle signs that I think most people would have thought were just signs of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
We were able to recognize, no, it's actually a situation of human trafficking. So we all worked together. We got her to the airport. We spoke with airport security because she's actually originally from Toronto. And this guy had became her boyfriend when she was 14. And then she wanted her freedom. So he convinced her to fly over to Edmonton. And they lived in Edmonton until he forced her into selling her body. And then he moved her again to Vancouver. And she tried to escape and go back home. But because he had her passports, the airports actually turned her away. And she had to go back with him. So we were actually able to get her back home and get her to escape
Wow.
her situation of human trafficking. So it does happen.
Wow.
Literally next door.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yikes.
That's a crazy story, but I mean, it's a, obviously it's prevalent if it's just like happenstance. It's literally next door to your father's coffee shop, but like really interesting to note what can be done in these situations and to catch those red flags. What would you suggest for not the children that may be the ones being abused, but the adults or other individuals in their lives that want to help? So you said you came in and helped things along and got her on her way back home. How can we, as bystanders, family members, friends, or just adults in general, how can we do that? How can we kind of get them in the right direction or catch those red flags and do something about it?
Yeah, I think that human trafficking is a symptom. Like sexual exploitation is a symptom, and I think that the best way to support a victim or youth who's being susceptible to exploitation is to address what need it is that they're seeking. Because you have these predators, what they do is they make a false promise of meeting that need, and so if we can address what need it is for that kid and steer them more in the healthy direction, I think that's a huge way to prevent exploitation. And another way is, if you have concerns about the kid, I think one thing is just de-glamorizing their situation. With a lot of kids, like when you present to kids and you give them scenarios that sound similar to their own, they start to realize that their own situation is not unique. And that boyfriend or friend is not just being nice. This tends to be a pattern. And so if we can de-glamorize what their situation is with their relationship or friendship, and show them that it could lead to exploitation, I think that's also a huge thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, lack of experience is something that they're probably taking advantage of with the younger individuals, right? Like as a teenager, every teenager knows that you're the center of the universe and everything's coming around you, right? So until people tell you otherwise, you think that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to note as someone that wants to help. You need to be aware of the fact that, they're going off of their experiences and they might not have that many.
Yeah, exactly. And then just healthy boundaries too, right? I think a lot of kids don't know what healthy boundaries are. We don't have explicit conversations. And I'm sure, I don't know if I feel like you'd probably be able to think of some scenarios too, but I know there were scenarios when I was in high school that I thought were normal. And then I graduated and I look back now and I'm like, no, that was really weird. So having more explicit conversations on what are healthy relationships and what do they look like, and what are exploitative type behaviors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Tiana, or Kyle, you can go ahead. I have 2 more questions, but you go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to ask Tiana, in that particular scenario, now obviously your sister and your family contacted you, and you've got a ton of expertise, and you were able to navigate getting them to the airport and getting them home. If somebody like myself overheard that conversation, what should I do as the bystander in that moment? What can I do to help break the cycle of human trafficking and exploitation?
Great question. So with the story that I shared, I wasn't actually there to do anything in that initial moment. What happened was my sister, all she did was just have a conversation with her. My mom acted like a mom, and we just they just came together to see, okay, what needs does she have right now? She has the need to go back home. She's worried about, her cell phone. The boyfriend had her cell phone, and she had taken his cell phone because she was worried about being tracked. So those were the things that we immediately addressed. So for her, okay, she needs to go back home. Well, let's give her a ride to the airport, or let's connect her with somebody where that we know can do that. Or she seems to be scared for her life. Okay, well, let's let her know that we can call the police and they can have an undercover police officer come and just meet her and provide her with supports and meet her wherever she's at. If it's that she's concerned that I don't know, her phone is being tracked. Like we actually gave her our phone to use in the meantime while she was talking to her mom. And discovering like, who is it that you do trust? Do you have their contact information? Let's get in contact with them. So it's kind of taking those steps one by one and seeing really with that particular person what they need and asking them that, because we can look at, we can look at someone and assume how we can help them best, but they know what they need.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
No, it's really good advice. Good question too, Kyle. I think like that's really important for us. If we ever were to see it, we don't want to just freeze up and not have any idea what to do, right? We want to be able to help. We want to be able to do something about it.
And there's,
I have two.
sorry,
Yes, sir, go ahead.
I'm going to say
Go ahead, Tiana. Yeah.
There's a National Human Trafficking Hotline as well that just got released a couple years ago, and I think that's a really good place to, if you have the time, to contact them as well.
Do you know the number off by heart?
I do not.
Good thing we all have a smartphone and a Google machine in our pockets at all times. There's no jingle or anything to remember. Like you can't have like a jingle to remember it or anything.
Now that you make one.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to make one and we'll publish it with this episode. Tiana,
right.
I have
it's not the easiest number to remember. Hold on.
Okay.
It's not the easiest number to remember. It's 1-833-900-1010.
Okay.
1-833-900-1010.
So Kyle and Drake, you want to go ahead and
Can we write a jingle right now, Drake?
People don't pay me for my singing voice, Tiana. Come on. They don't even pay me for my thoughts, and I'm a PhD student. So, Tiana, I have two questions for you that were kind of off of what you've been talking about. I feel like the sentiments are kind of there for not necessarily children per se, but I think it's something that's kind of become a cultural phenomenon, and it's sugar babies and sugar daddies. Talking about like the fact that you're giving people something and you're necessarily like they're in debt for it. I find sugar babies and sugar daddies and sugar mommies and sugar grandmommies, whatever you want to call it. I think that that's a really unique relationship where you're clearly you're getting money from somebody with the expectation of doing something in return, but they might be gray areas or muddiness within that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh man. Okay. So I'm going to be very unpopular, I think, when I say what I'm going to say. I think again, like there's a culture being created right now where we're trying to take equality and empowerment to an extreme where we want to normalize exploitative behaviors. And I'm going to be very unpopular when I say this because I think a lot of times sugar babies and this kind of trend right now is being seen and advertised as women's empowerment. And I strongly disagree with that. Because when it comes down to it, we want to look at power imbalances, right? Like that's where exploitation comes to play. So in a sugar baby relationship, you have one party that is more marginalized. You have one party that is a vulnerable population. They typically are female. They're typically younger. They typically don't have an education. They typically don't have the income and lifestyle that they need. And so automatically there's that power imbalance. And what are you exchanging is yourself. So I personally see that as exploitation. And it's almost like, where's the line? You're talking about blurred lines, and I agree with you. I think it's a slippery slope when we go down that route, and so that's where I stand with the sugar baby thing. And I think we're starting to groom kids, honestly, into sexual exploitation with the sugar baby concept because most sugar babies go into it right after they graduate high school. And so these girls already, before they graduated, have this idea in their head that that's a route that they can take, is exploiting themselves. And just because they turn 18, you're 17 one night, you sleep, you wake up the next morning, you're 18, and now all of a sudden it's not exploitation. So that's my perspective on it, and I know that it's not popular with some people, but
no, you know what? I appreciate that perspective, and I agree. The sentiment has been, I mean, the way it's been pushed, it seems, has been that it's female sexual empowerment. That you might as well get paid for something that you're not getting paid for using your body, right? And I see that, but I also completely agree with you that it is a slippery slope when you start putting X amount of money for certain activities or certain things you're doing for somebody, and that power dynamic can be really, really tricky and confusing. And I don't know. I'm sure there are good experiences within that, but I'm sure as you're kind of alluding to, it can be leading to a lot more sexual exploitation and just really bad situations for individuals that are in that power dynamic.
Definitely. My philosophy is, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Sorry. My personal philosophy, and again, this is coming from being in the field of human trafficking, but I don't believe that there should be a price point on a human body. That's just my, just philosophically speaking, and not to blame anybody who is in that situation at all. But I have a higher standard for human beings being treated like human beings, and I don't believe that any human being should be treated like property by anybody else. So,
absolutely. I appreciate the perspective on that, Tiana. The last question I have, and this is again kind of like a social, trend / just the way that things have been going within our culture. The Me Too movement. Do you think that might play a role in the future of sexual exploitation and human trafficking, or is it already playing a role in this conversation and this education kind of growing?
That's a great question. I definitely think it plays a role. I think the more these issues come to light, because sexual exploitation and human trafficking, they're connected to social issues, right? So I definitely think that it has helped. I think that what it helps more with is that peer exploitation piece, more than it does the grooming into trafficking piece. But I know that it does bring to light that making people more comfortable coming forward and speaking up and sharing their stories and feeling like they can be heard, because I think a lot of victims don't share their stories because they don't feel like they can be heard or that they'll be believed. So
absolutely.
Tiana, we've covered a lot of ground here, and before we kind of always transition towards the end of our show, we like to ask our guests if they've got any really interesting myths or misconceptions. You've come in packing a lot of heat with some really interesting numbers. Do you have more of those in the bag that you'd be willing to share with us that you find are really shocking?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Again, it's difficult because it's hard to have actual numbers. But I think something that is interesting is that with human trafficking in Canada, over 90% of victims are Canadian, and over 90% of the traffickers are Canadian as well. So it's a Canadian issue. It's done by Canadians to Canadians. It's not so much of the Taken type storyline that we see. And I think another piece also is that we tend to think of predators as being that 60-year-old person. And not to say that does not exist. It definitely does. But the average age of a predator, an exploiter in Canada, is only 25. So they range from 13 to 32 years old. Statistically, that's what we're seeing. So predator can be anyone. And then it's more about defining that person by what they're doing so much as more than what they look like. So
absolutely.
Wow.
That's really interesting. Tiana, this has been awesome. This has been really informative, and I'm sure that our listeners have really enjoyed learning more about something that's never talked about. Really, I mean, I haven't had a conversation with this really, I'll never have a conversation as this in depth on this topic, but it's been really wonderful. Even though the topic's quite heavy, and we acknowledge that it's been heavy, it's really informative, really, really impactful stuff that you're doing. I'm curious if this is an issue. I know that sexual assault, there's a lot of, when it comes to sexual assault literature, people of minority or LGBTQ groups are often victims. Is that the case as well within this that you're aware of?
Yeah, great point. Yeah, so when we talk about sexual exploitation, a lot of the grooming, when it comes to the boyfriending process of traffickers, is female focused, with females being most of the victims. But it definitely happens to the LGBTQ community and also to boys as well. It just looks different. So typically, what we see with the LGBTQ community and with boys is more of the being connected to someone who's acting like a friend or some kind of like a father figure, for example. And it's more about exploitation on the street level. So what we see with boys, for example, is something called gay for pay. So a lot of the boys will be exchanging sexual acts just for their basic needs, including shelter, for example, and they have somebody that's older that they look up to that's kind of showing them the ropes. And we tend to see that same thing with LGBTQ community, where these teens, they definitely, a lot of them have not felt that support at home, and they're looking for a place to call home, but they don't have the money to back it up. And unfortunately, a lot of these teens tend to run away from home. And so again, they connect with someone who's a little bit older, who's trying to show them the ropes of how to be on the streets, and they exchange sexual acts for basic necessities. And then also we see with boys specifically is where we see a rise in sextortion. So I think that that's a misconception. A lot of times we think it's female, but we are seeing there was an 89% increase in sextortion of boys within a span of 2 years, because we see a certain type of predator just preying on boys as well. So it's not just a female issue. It just looks different depending on what type of sexual exploitation you're looking at.
Absolutely. Great. No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for clarifying. Because I mean, we don't want to obviously make it seem like it's just a female, females that are being victims. Yeah. And I think that like it's obviously we talked about a lot about power dynamics today as well, right? And being a female with a male predator is a power dynamic in itself. But being a male, there's that machoism where we think that based on the masculine scripts that they can't be prey, they can't be victims, and that's obviously not the case. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. This has been really, really informative, Tiana. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Tiana, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. How can our audience get in touch with you, reach out to you, and learn more about all the fantastic work that C is doing?
Yeah, the best place to go to is our website, sexualexploitationeducation.com. It has all of our media on there. We have resources on there and some facts about the issue. And I actually keep it updated with up-to-date stories as well on exploitation. So,
yeah. Awesome. And you're active on Instagram. I know this because we talked through Instagram.
Yeah, Instagram is the main platform that I'm the most active on. So.
All right.
Yeah, and you can find her on Sexual Exploitation Education on Instagram as well.
Perfect.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiana.
With that, we'll wrap up another episode of Brain Buzz. You can follow and review Brain Buzz on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to our newsletter at brainbuzzpod.com and join us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BrainBuzzPod. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.